We'll give it just one more minute, but folks continue to trickle in.
Great.
All right, well, why don't I get us started? Welcome everyone to CCAP's program this afternoon. I'm Evan Seaman. I'm chair of CCAPA's program committee, and I am a land use lawyer at Robinson & Cole in Hartford. And we have a really timely and interesting program today called Statewide Planning, the draft 2025-2030 Conservation and Development Policies Plan for Connecticut. So today we've got several folks from the Office of Responsible Growth who will walk through the draft and explain proposed changes to its focus, structure, and intended implementation. You'll hear about where the draft is in the process, and you'll also have the opportunity to provide comment on the draft plan today or in the future. Comments of the draft will be accepted through June 30th, 2024, and considered in preparation for a final plan launching, I think, in the fall of 2024. In addition to hearing about the process for adopting the state's plan, you'll also hear about how you can help support its passage and implementation. I'll drop a link in the chat that will bring you to the webpage in just a minute. But before I do that, I wanted to introduce our panelists today. And the first is a very familiar face, CCAPA's former chair, Rebecca Auger. Rebecca has spent over 20 years as a municipal, regional, and consulting planner in Connecticut, and she currently leads the Connecticut Office of Responsible Growth, which is responsible for the State Conservation and Development Policies Plan, administering the Connecticut Environmental Policies Act, coordinating with regional and municipal planning, and guiding state land use policy. We also have Justine Phillips-Galucci, and Justine participates in the development and implementation of the State Conservation and Development Policies Plan and assists in neighborhood revitalization zone processes. Prior to joining OPM, Justine earned her bachelor's in environmental studies from the University of Connecticut and a master's of environmental management from the Yale School of the Environment, focusing on environmental restoration in urban areas. And then last, as part of my introduction, is Rebecca Dahl. Rebecca is a planning analyst with OPM, and she helps to develop and implement the State Conservation and Development Policies Plan, aids in coordinating the Connecticut Environmental Policy Act, and serves as the state drought coordinator. That's pretty interesting. And then prior to joining OPM, Ms. Dahl worked in land conservation in both Connecticut and New York, and attended UConn, where she earned her bachelor's degree in animal science, also very interesting, and a master's in public administration. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca in a minute, but I did want to just note that there's a Q&A button on the bottom of this Zoom where you can enter questions or comments. And one of the goals today, you'll hear Rebecca and others explain, is to get public comment on the draft plan. So what you actually, what we're hoping for is what you'll provide to us is public comment that will help to guide future drafts of this plan. So click that Q&A button, write your question or comment down, and we'll take that into consideration. And with that, why don't I hand it over now to you, Rebecca?
Great, thanks, Evan. And thank you to CCAPA for having us today and hosting this program for us. So I'm also gonna just introduce quickly, we have the rest of the Office of Responsible Growth with us today as well. Bruce Witchen is an environmental analyst in the office, and Phil Shattuck is a planning analyst in the office. And they're here to assist with any questions you may have. So I'm going to start us off by giving some background on not only the C&D plan, but also on the Office of Responsible Growth. And then we're going to have Becca dive into the plan itself. And Justine's going to walk us through the locational guide map as it is proposed now. And then we're going to touch on new implementation mechanisms that we are proposing for the 2025 to 2030 C&D plan. After that, we look forward to having discussion and hearing comments from you. So I think we'll try to move through the presentation and hold questions to the end. Phil, if you could advance the slide, please. Great. All right, so we're going to start off with what is the Office of Responsible Growth, because we recognize that you may be hearing more about this office as of late. It's making its way into a lot of proposed legislation, but it is not a new office, even though it was just codified in statute last year. It's been around since the mid-2000s. Governor Well created it through executive order. And its role is really to coordinate state efforts around planning and land use. And its primary way of doing that is through the development of the Conservation and Development Policies Plan, but we also get involved in a lot of other interagency efforts, as well as some of the things that you heard that Justine and Becca are involved in as far as the Connecticut Environmental Policies Act and other. We refer to ourselves as ORG, so you may hear us talk about ORG in the rest of the presentation. Next slide. Next, what is the C&D plan? Sometimes called the state POCD. I see a lot of familiar faces here, so I'm sure you're all familiar with it. But it is a 5-year plan, which is something to keep in mind. It's different from regional and local plans in that it's a shorter planning horizon. And it's really a comprehensive plan to guide state agencies. It is intended to establish statewide policy around land use issues, but really guide agency planning, programming, and actions. And there are specific actions that are called out by state statute that need to be consistent with the C&D plan. And we'll touch on these again at the end, but they're around the acquisition and development of property, as well as public transportation equipment. Next slide, please. So the plan itself has been around for several decades. The first one was adopted in the late 70s, and it's gone through a couple of evolutions, and we're hoping to continue to evolve the plan. Earlier iterations, especially in the 80s and 90s, really focused on setting long-term goals and establishing guidance for agencies to work towards those goals. And these earlier iterations included what was called a locational guide map, though it's not required of the plan to include that element. But again, the locational guide map was included truly as a guide, as you can see from the excerpt at the top of the screen from the 1982 to 85 plan. It was not intended to be akin to a future land use plan, as we find in a lot of local POCDs. It really was meant to work in conjunction with the text of the plan and be more illustrative than anything else. More recent versions of the C&D plan have been structured around the state's 6 growth management principles, which were developed in the mid-2000s, the same time that the Office of Responsible Growth was developed. And under that structure, we have the growth management principles, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with because local POCDs need to consider them. And then we have corresponding policy statements under each principle. There was a change in law also that required the plan to develop a new kind of mapping that is called priority funding area mapping, which was really intended to designate areas of the state as priorities for development or growth activities. And our opinion at ORG is that this structure with the growth management principles providing the framework of the plan and the priority funding area mapping has enabled a more siloed approach to implementation of what is intended to be a comprehensive plan. And so you'll see what we've found over time is that agencies are able to sort of choose from among the policy statements within the plan some supporting language around what it is that they're trying to do, while not grappling with any of the other policy statements that are also in the plan that might conflict with what they're trying to do. And relying on a priority funding area map to try to support what they're doing at a very site-specific level also enables agencies to not really face what are the conflicting policy statements within the plan. And so we're hoping to continue to evolve the plan. And as you'll see, when Becca goes through the text and Justine goes through the proposed locational guide map, we're really almost cycling back to our earlier iterations of this plan. You'll see that we're incorporating more of these concepts of developing our long-term goals and priorities and providing good, clear guidance to agencies, but not trying to get down to a directive at a sort of site-specific scale. Next slide, please. And this shift in the plan is partially a result of the recommendations of the Commission on Connecticut's Development and Future, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but this was a group that was tasked with addressing a whole host of issues around planning and land use in Connecticut through Public Act 21-29. And I think we have several people in attendance who participated in that process. There was a working group of the commission that was dedicated solely to the C&D plan itself, and their recommendations, which were incorporated and adopted by the commission in the fall of 2023, included transforming the C&D plan into a more visionary and objective setting document that relies on data and analysis to arrive at those objectives. There were no recommendations around changing the adoption process. It's still recommended to be a legislatively adopted plan that's developed by OPM in conjunction with a continuing legislative committee on planning and development. That the plan have a more robust planning process, that it more meaningfully engage stakeholders in the development of the plan, and it have a more transparent process around it. And one of the key elements of the recommendations was to ensure implementation of the C&D plan. A lot of the discussion was around how it's unknown how the plan gets implemented, or is it even implementable as in its current format. And then there was also a lot of discussion around integrating local, regional, and statewide planning in a more robust way. And the working group really focused in on COGS being sort of a key component of that, and there being opportunities for COGS to really help marry statewide policy to local planning and development. Next slide, please. And so as ORG considered all of these recommendations when we were kicking off the process to develop this plan, we really focused in on several things. First, conducting a more transparent and robust planning process where we really tried to engage our state agencies throughout the process, as well as the continuing committee. We tried to engage them. I can't say that we effectively achieved that, but we really tried to make this a more transparent planning process and get some buy-in from state agencies early in the process to the plan itself. We also focused on setting longer-term goals and shorter-term priorities, given that this is only a 5-year plan. We wanted goals to be clear, but also priorities to be even clearer as to what is the state focused on for the 2025 to 2030 period. We wanted to increase cross-sector collaboration, especially among and within agencies, I would say. There is a lot that occurs, but we feel it can be strengthened. And so we thought that the planning process itself was an opportunity to do that, and that the C&D plan and its implementation should further that. And then we devoted a lot of time to thinking about how can we develop some new implementation mechanisms to really improve not only our outcomes, but transparency around agency decision-making and decisions around where we're investing state resources. And so we consciously made the choice not to explicitly address that final recommendation of the Commission on Connecticut's Development and Future regarding the vertical integration of planning from the state regions down to the local level. We did that partially because we think that that is an issue that requires a lot of thought and exploration, and we simply didn't have enough time to address that. But also we felt that we really need to first strengthen state level implementation of the plan, and really breed that culture of collaboration among state agencies in order to have a strong foundation from which to address that vertical integration of state, regional, and local planning. Nevertheless, we know that simply by virtue of establishing statewide priorities and guiding agencies in their plans, policies, and programming, that the C&D plan has the potential to significantly impact municipalities and COGS through the guidance of state investments and resources. So we also recognize that this could be even more apparent in the 2025 to 2030 planning horizon, when we expect, at least in the latter half, federal resources to be less available than they are now, excuse me, and therefore state resources to be all the more important. So we recognize the impact of the C&D plan, and we therefore are very interested in hearing from municipalities and COGS around the draft plan itself. So this is all by way of saying that ORG considers our current draft plan a transitional plan, where we are moving away from the most recent structure of the last couple of iterations of the plan from the growth management principles and the priority funding areas. Though we feel strongly that we have incorporated the growth management principles within this draft plan, they no longer form the structure and framework of the plan itself. And as you'll see when Justine goes through the locational guide map, we're moving away from priority funding areas, or at least proposing to. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Becca to get us into the plan itself.
Thanks, Rebecca. So as you can see here, we have a nice pyramid structure for our plan. And as Rebecca mentioned, we are shifting away from structuring the plan around the 6 growth management principles. And while they've previously provided great guidance or great statements, we're really evolving the plan to illustrate the intersectionality of the various sectors and state agencies that the C&D plan informs. So as you can see here, we have our pyramid broken down into 4 sections, and we'll get into greater detail of each of these sections as we move through the presentation, but I'm going to give just a brief overview and then move us into some of the more detailed description of each of these. At the bottom, we have the guiding principles as our foundational component of the plan. These are really intended to illustrate the state's values as well as cut across all sectors. And I like to say that they serve as the North Star of the plan. So these are the 4 guiding principles that will be consulted when there may be potential conflict that arises in state agency actions. Moving up the pyramid, we have the vision statement. So these will outline the near-term goals for the 5-year planning period and are intended to further guide state investments. And up at the top, we have the measures and policies. So the policies really will be guiding how state agencies operate, how they create plans and programs on their own, as well as interact with other state agencies and stakeholders, while the measures will be used as a barometer for us to measure our collective state agency processes as we move throughout the 2025 and 2030 period. And again, we'll get into a little more detail on those implementation measures in just a bit. Next slide. Thanks, Phil. So the guiding principles here, we have 4 of them: sustainable, equitable and just, vibrant, and resilient. And these are not intended to be just for one sector, even though we hear some of these more often in some sectors than others, these terms like sustainable or resilient. We really see these as lenses for state agencies to use to view their activities and, again, continue to guide their policies. We also see this as a means for agencies to really ensure that agencies are working in conjunction with one another and ensure that state investments are building off of one another rather than conflicting with each other. Next slide, please. So we do have a longer description of each of these 4 guiding principles: sustainable, equitable, and just, vibrant, and resilient. I'm not going to read through all of them, but they're here for your reference. To give you just a brief overview of each of these. Sustainable, again, we hear this frequently used in the environmental space, but we do intend it to be used through all sectors. So we're looking to balance the ecological, social, and economic dimensions of conservation and development to meet the current needs without compromising the future. Moving down into equitable and just, again, we are seeing this more across different sectors, but often see this in social places. As a group of planners that we're talking to, you know better than anyone else that our built environment affects the society that we live in. So we want to continue to emphasize an equitable and just society. We want to ensure that people of all ages, of all races, what have you, in Connecticut are able to live and thrive and are considered as we continue to direct investments. Moving down to the vibrancy, this covers both our cultural, historical, and natural resources, as well as the economic dimensions of our state investments and how they shape the different communities that we are building. We are looking to ensure that, again, these are creating vibrant, unique communities. What Connecticut is known for is all of our wonderful towns that have their own elements to highlight their own types of businesses. And we want to continue to support that and celebrate the unique aspects of our different regions, our different towns, again, while making considerations of the other 3 guiding principles. And then finally, our 4th guiding principle is resilience. Again, this is used very often in a climate change sphere, and we do intend for it to be used that way, but we also intend for it to be used throughout. One of the examples we often use in describing this guiding principle is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic that required a resilience on all sectors for us to be able to adjust quickly, to be able to provide healthcare, to be able to continue to keep the economy moving. And that is demonstrating a level of resilience and ability to adapt. So we want to continue to ensure that our agencies are ready to adapt and are directing investments towards projects and plans that will allow them to do so. Next slide, please. I'm going to shift away from our guiding principles into our vision statements. Again, these are our 5-year short-term vision areas that we'd like the plan to focus on. These are intended to, again, continue to guide the current state investments that we're making, but we do want to continue to keep an eye on the future. We also recognize that these vision areas or near-term challenges, they may have all predated the 5-year plan, and they may continue to be priorities in the future. But again, right now we've identified them as the current pressing needs. And that is, as Rebecca mentioned before, of particular importance, as we will see in 2025 and onward, that federal funds will continue to taper off, and that investment will need to be, we'll need to continue making those investments, and will unfortunately not have the same level of federal support. So these 5 visions, as you can see, are a thriving economy, housing for current and future residents, stewardship of resources, healthy people and places, and connected and inclusive communities. Next slide, please. So each of these has a brief description here. And I think they're all relatively self-explanatory. We are, again, concerned about our thriving economy. We want to continue to ensure that we have a flourishing and diverse economy that leverages our location. Housing is, of course, a major challenge for this next 5-year period as we're looking to increase affordable housing, as we know we are short units at the current time and are trying to plan for current residents as well as attracting future residents. Stewardship of our natural resources as well as our cultural and historic resources. We're moving down to healthy people and places. This is where we're considering a lot of the public health impact, as well as considering the places that the communities and the way that they shape those public health impacts and how they impact the mental, emotional, and social health of the people in Connecticut as well. And then finally, the connected and inclusive communities. We want to consider the fact, again, that we have all these unique communities, but how do they interrelate to one another within the state of Connecticut? How are they connected, both in the social dynamic as well as in the infrastructure of the communities? And then pulling out, just looking a little bit larger, how Connecticut fits into its larger region within the Northeast and then the Northeast mega region. So next slide, please. So this slide takes our visions and sort of pulls them together within the Venn diagram pictured here. And I personally really like this illustration because it very quickly shows the interdependence and the interwoven nature of all of these different sectors and all of these visions that we're discussing. It also provides us some opportunity to think about where there are creative problem-solving options within those intersections. So before I start naming any, I do want to note that these are all examples. This is not intended to be an inclusive or exclusive, a full list by any means. We just put in a few to start kind of getting everyone's gears going and give you some broad understanding. So between the stewardship of resources and thriving economy, vision areas, and the intersection, we have brownfields remediation. And that is one of those areas where we see a very clear option for improving our environment by providing that kind of remediation, but we're also creating more spaces. We're creating the opportunity for that reuse, for new economic development, for new housing opportunities potentially. There's a lot of different options there. And as we very clearly can see that, we know that the agencies that direct those actions, again, may have that tendency to be siloed. So we want to use these visions and use this plan as a vehicle to really have those conversations about the intersection. I'll also highlight just the one in the middle, which really impacts and cross-cuts against across all 5 vision areas, which is climate change. And this is, we know that climate change will have an impact on all of these 5 sectors, and we also know that all of these 5 vision areas will have an impact on climate change. So it's an all hands on deck kind of situation. And while it's very easy to push this over to the environmental state agencies, it really involves all of them. So again, just continuing to try to break down silos and encourage the creative problem solving as well as leveraging investments from one agency to another. I'd also like to just point out on the left-hand side of the slide, we have a brief description of each of what the vision areas will have as you encounter them in the plan. They'll have a vision statement to give you a broader idea of what each one is getting at. We did share those vision statements in the previous slide. Strengths and challenges that we've identified for this near-term 5-year term, as well as some of the targets to direct investment. Next slide, please. Excellent. And then we have at the top of our pyramid our high-level policies. Again, these are really geared towards how state agencies operate, either when they're developing their plans, developing programs, or directing their own investment. We also see these as an opportunity to aid in activating the relationships between agencies, as well as the relationships agencies have with their stakeholders. So as we go through this list, we know that we want agencies to seek multiple benefits and optimize those resources. We want to continue to find those opportunities to leverage federal and private resources, as well as leverage state resources against one another. Encouraging more planning and preliminary phasing, and really just more opportunities for earlier interactions between state agencies as they're planning through their year plan, their grant programs, what have you. We'd like them to develop greater capacity to govern, develop, and leverage and use existing data. My colleague Justine in just a moment will get into some more about the data that she used and was pulling together with the help of our GIS office at OPM. But we want to continue to build off of all of the data that exists, including GIS and elsewhere. But that map will be a very good example of how we hope to do that. We want to continue to look at regional solutions and continue to encourage, again, leveraging regional municipalities in regional areas to really to create efficient use of limited resources. We also want to continue to ensure that there's some more communication both across agencies as well as within agencies, so that these visions can be fully realized as from someone in maybe lower in the structure of an agency all the way up to the top and across different agency programs, and then of course across different agencies. And then finally, we are encouraging state agencies to have more meaningful engagement and outreach towards their stakeholders, whether that's the communities that they're working in, whether that potentially could impact another fellow state agency, or the municipalities and the regions, the regional COGs, really any groups that may be involved in the land use decisions that those agencies are making. So with that, I will pass it over to Justine to start getting into the locational guide map.
Thanks, Becca. So there are several statutes that refer to the locational guide map of the C&D plan and require OPM to develop boundaries for priority funding areas to direct agencies' investments in growth-related projects. So the state's original approach for identifying priority funding areas on the locational guide map used U.S. Census blocks as the base geographic unit of mapping. Census blocks tend to vary greatly in size. They're small in places with high population density and larger in lightly populated areas. And this has proved problematic in previous iterations of the locational guide map and priority funding area maps, because an entire area of a census block would be identified as a priority funding area, even when there was not infrastructure to support that designation throughout the census block. Thus, some areas that would be prime for conservation were designated as appropriate for development. Because this C&D plan is meant to be a transitional plan, ORG sought to develop a new methodology for creating the map you see here in hopes of addressing some of these issues. So next slide, please. So in ORG's opinion, a map made at a statewide scale should not be used to make site-specific decisions. It should be illustrative of current conditions and not prescriptive of future land uses. So the methodology we used was based on research from the Brookings Institute and the Indianapolis Metropolitan Planning Organization, and we used a suitability analysis to identify activity centers with help from the GIS office. Activity centers are where employment hubs, civic uses, transportation assets, cultural attractions, and medical and educational institutions cluster at a local scale. So the presence of multiple components or specific key components at multiple thresholds enabled stratification of activity centers by type or intensity. We use data on cultural, civic, and commercial features and traffic and transportation that was sourced from OpenStreetMap and our sister agencies to develop the model. We used a scale of 1 mile neighborhood and half-mile cell, which provided sufficient detail to capture both rural and urban centers, though we've been considering whether it might be useful to consider separate methodologies for both rural and urban. The activity centers were then overlaid onto several conservation factors, including existing preserved open space, inundation areas, wetland and prime farmland soils, core forests, aquifer protection areas, drinking water supply watersheds, and critical habitats. This was to highlight that the presence of conservation factors in activity centers must be considered when we're weighing the appropriateness of a potential state action. The presence of multiple conservation factors outside of an activity center might also point to areas to prioritize for conservation, resource protection, and connectivity enhancements. So understanding the location of activity centers and their relative intensities allows for consideration of the C&D plans, policies, and implementation measures, and allows agencies to target plans, programs, and actions appropriately. We envision agencies looking at the map for guidance, maybe overlaying it with their own mapping. For example, DEEP's Urban Green and Community Garden Grant Program could overlay the map with the existing protected open space mapping to look for centers of activity outside of the 5 major cities where they could target their grants for enhancing urban green spaces. Next slide, please. So we roughly identified 5 levels of activity centers in Connecticut, and we hope to continue to refine these over time. They're listed here, but I'll go into a little more detail on the following slides. So next slide. Thanks. So the first designation is major center. These are really where those areas that cluster significant civic, cultural, commercial, and transportation activity in small geographic areas. These include parts of New Haven, Hartford, Bridgeport, Waterbury, and Stamford. Here in Hartford, for example, within that purple area, we have Hartford Hospital to the south, a number of government buildings, some Trinity College and UConn buildings, high density of CT transit stops and restaurants and libraries, and a high volume of traffic traveling in and out on a daily basis. Next slide. And then next we have regional mixed use centers, which are in this dark red color. These also have considerable commercial, civic, cultural, and transportation uses, but within regions of the state or clustering around major centers. These include parts of New Britain, Meriden, Windham, and Norwalk. Here in Middletown, there's Wesleyan University, restaurants, and other commercial assets along Main Street in the center of this dark red area, and also Middlesex Hospital. So there's still a lot going on, but just not with the same level of intensity and traffic as you might see in one of our major centers. Next slide, please. Next are the regional activity zones, which are in this bright reddish orange. And these have relatively high commercial and transportation uses and more moderate densities of civic and cultural features. So this is East Hartford, which has a high density of commercial features and transit, and also sees a lot of traffic along 84. Next slide. And then we have our neighborhood activity zones in orange, and these have strong commercial, civic, and transportation activity along corridors as well. Here's Torrington. A lot of those features were a bit more spread out throughout the town in little pockets, as opposed to being clustered in the center like we saw with Hartford or Middletown. Next slide. And then finally, we have rural centers and corridor activity zones. These cluster commercial, civic, and cultural uses in relatively small geographic areas or along corridors. So an example of a rural center in Scotland here, where there's a fire department, a town hall, a post office, and some other uses here in this very small yellow area. And then over here, we have the corridor activity zone with commercial and cultural features along the Route 17 corridor in Durham. So overall, this map is meant to reflect where activity is already present and where investments could be directed for densification, connectivity, and inclusivity as appropriate. And I'm going to turn it back to Rebecca, I think. Yes, either Rebecca.
You have a good chance of being correct. So moving on into implementation. So as you just saw, as Justine walked through the locational guide map, again, which we're proposing to go in a different direction from priority funding areas. We anticipate that we may get some pushback on that from legislators. However, we feel that some of the other changes that we're suggesting in implementation will more than make up for the lack of a priority funding area map, and indeed might be stronger tools for ensuring implementation of our priorities through the life of the plan. So what are we proposing for implementation? Well, first, we're not proposing to make any changes to the requirement that state agency plans that are federally or state mandated be consistent with the C&D plan. That ORG has an opportunity to see draft plans and comment on draft plans, and we would like to continue in that fashion. We are not proposing any changes to the type of actions that need to be consistent with the C&D plan, and we'll talk about those again in a moment. But we are suggesting that we change the monetary threshold of those actions that require consistency, while also requiring that there be some kind of reporting and documentation around how agencies are considering the C&D plan when they're making their decisions around those actions. Again, we'll talk about that in a second. The new elements of implementation that we are proposing are first, establishing an ad hoc implementation committee for the life of the plan. This would be a group made up of staff from state agencies, all state agencies, but really the ones that have a lot to do with land use. And the objectives of this ad hoc committee would be, first and foremost, to help us develop the reporting mechanisms of implementation of the C&D plan. Secondly, to help us keep up to date the resources appendix that we've included in the C&D plan. So under each of the 5 vision areas, we have put together sort of resources and ongoing initiatives from state agencies. And so it's basically programs, grant opportunities, and those kinds of things. We heard a lot in the development of the plan of requests for, is there any just clearinghouse of statewide activity around these vision areas? And so we attempted to start to put that together, but we know that that will be changing constantly. And so one of the tasks of this ad hoc committee would be to try to keep that up to date annually. So that could be a resource for not only agencies, but also regions, municipalities, and others. And then lastly, and most importantly, is that this ad hoc committee would provide a forum for collaboration among agencies. And while there is collaboration happening among agencies, the goal of this plan really is to get it to happen earlier and more robustly. We would like agencies to be thinking cross-sector about these 5 priorities when they are starting to develop their programs, not necessarily when they're just about to award grants within the programs. And so we think it's important that we have a regular cadence of meetings around the C&D plan, and that we have this opportunity for agencies to think about its implementation together. We're also proposing to regularly engage the continuing legislative committee around implementation of the C&D plan. We think it's important that we keep our legislators up to date on how implementation is going. It would enable them to understand the challenges. It would enable them to be more up to speed when it comes around time to develop the 2030 to 2035 C&D plan. instead of having to re-educate them as to what the C&D plan is, and just build more buy-in to the C&D plan. The hope is that if we can transition the C&D plan to being a more used document, that they themselves might consider it when they're thinking about projects within their districts. And then lastly, we are proposing to offer open office hours, basically, with ORG on a regular basis around the C&D plan so that we can hear from other stakeholders. We did hear from a lot of advocacy organizations as we were developing the plan, and we'd like to be able to continue that dialogue. And so we're considering, excuse me, quarterly or biannual open office hours just around C&D plan issues. Next slide, please. So the implementation measures that are included in the plan, again, these are directed towards those state agency actions that are required to be consistent. And those include acquiring property, improving property, or acquiring public transportation equipment and facilities. And we are again proposing to increase the monetary threshold, which is currently $200,000 for a project that does one of these actions, to $1 million, and requiring that there be documentation of consistency with the C&D plan for those $1 million or more projects. So we developed a list of implementation measures to be used as sort of the potential measures of consistency with the C&D plan. So the measures are essentially trying to take the guiding principles and the visions and put them into a more action-oriented sort of language. What we are envisioning is that agencies will go through the entire list when they have a project or an action in front of them that needs to demonstrate consistency with the C&D plan. We know that not all of the implementation measures will be relevant to that particular action. However, we're asking that agencies consider them all so that we don't resort back to just sort of picking and choosing supportive language. The intent, again, is for that ad hoc implementation committee to help us develop the process for reporting or documenting consistency for those actions with the C&D plan. Next slide, please. So we've provided just a sample in this slide. I'm sure it's hard to read of some of the implementation measures. Again, they're all in the draft plan, and we'd encourage you to review them and comment on them. But it's, again, just trying to put those principles and visions into action. And really, you know, when we think about the structure of the plan, we have the foundational principles sort of guiding how agencies should act or conduct their business in conservation and development. We have the visions where we have established some targets, which are about to really about setting the direction we want agencies to move to achieve our visions. And then we have these implementation measures that are really project oriented and are intended to be a decision-making tool, essentially. Next slide, please. So that's the draft plan. Our next steps with this, we are accepting public comments on this draft through June 30th. And we'd really encourage not only your feedback, but we'd ask that you talk about this with your elected officials and even your state legislators, because we need their feedback as well. We will be conducting meetings through the COGS. So you may get additional invitations to similar meetings, but targeting more your elected officials than planners. And get those comments into us. We will be reviewing those alongside our sister agencies over the summer so that we can develop the next draft of the plan, which is due to the continuing legislative committee by December 1st. The continuing committee is responsible for conducting the public hearing on the plan and making its recommendation to the full General Assembly for adoption in the 2025 legislative session. So with that, next slide, I think you'll see the email address that comments can be sent into, but we'd be happy to have discussion now and hear some feedback now.
That's great. Thank you so much, everyone. We do have a couple questions that have come in, so I will share those with you now, and I'm not sure who from your team will address them, but the first question is, how does implementation as well as the locational guide methodology intend to prioritize, include, or address environmental justice communities?
So I can start off, and anyone from ORG can jump in. I would say that through the visions and policies, as well as the implementation measures, we have tried to incorporate environmental justice concerns. I would say that the locational guide map as it is just a description of activity centers. It does not address EJ concerns at all. But I would suggest, reading through some of the targets under the vision areas, as well as the implementation measures, to see how we have incorporated environmental justice concerns.
If I can just quickly piggyback off of that too, I think that this is one of those issues that if you kind of go back to that Venn diagram that we showed, this is an issue that it is an absolute intersection between several of our vision areas. And so as Rebecca described and showed earlier, the implementation measures will illustrate that there is that intersection when it comes up to environmental justice issues. But that's really what these are the types of issues that the plan is being developed to address specifically. So.
All right, thanks. We had another similar question to that one that I'm going to skip over for now. But the next question that I see here is one about how do you think the draft plan is going to help to increase beneficial interaction with local communities? The person who posed this question has noted that that's something that there's been a little difficulty to obtain in the past. So how do you think this will help address that issue?
Well, our hope is that having the plan establish priorities and agencies having clear priorities is a step in the right direction. I think under the previous plans, it hasn't always been clear what are our priorities. We have these principles we're supposed to abide by, but what are our priorities for this planning horizon? Secondly, we hope that having better collaboration among agencies benefits municipalities in that they have clearer guidance, clearer understanding of where they should be heading, especially if they want to use state resources to help them get where they're trying to head. I guess if I'm not answering the question, Hiram, maybe you could clarify what you mean by having a hard time seeing a beneficial interaction with municipalities.
One more question, and I actually have a question or two as well. So next one, when you guys were looking at the new funding area metrics and putting that together, did you take into consideration any, I guess, local POCDs or other, what kind of plans, if any, did you review, municipal plans out there when you put that together?
We didn't look specifically at local POCDs. We have looked at regional plans more so. We also are familiar and have looked at many of the municipal affordable housing plans. But if by referring to new funding area metrics, if we're thinking about those as the vision areas, that is really based on our discussions with our sister agencies as our priorities that are overlapping among agencies. If you're thinking of the funding area metrics as the mapping, that's not what we intend the mapping to do. And the mapping really is intended to just show where we have a confluence of activities to help guide agencies in identifying opportunity areas.
So you have a lot of people on this program today. We had, I think, at one point, over 60 people. You know, that makes up local planners, regional planners, other planning professionals, land use lawyers, and others. What can we do to help you throughout this process? Is, you know, aside from just providing public comment, is there, you know, how can we help facilitate public comment, or what else can we do to help you in your work?
Thank you for that question. As many of you know, because I recognize a lot of names here, the legislative interest in this plan has waned over time, and we have been combating that through the process of the development of this plan. And so it would be great if CCAPA and you as individual planners within communities support this plan. If you feel like this is headed in a good direction, for you to talk to your elected officials about that and build some support for it. And also to talk to other agencies that you interact with about it. We know that with the group that we've been working with, we have support among other agencies, but we have several very large agencies that we know communication within is not always the greatest. And so, you know, the more that there is a vocal and apparent level of support for the plan, the better the chances of it being adopted in the 2025 legislative session.
And so is the next draft available December 1st?
It will be. We hope it will be available before that. We'll be working on it in the fall. Obviously, we're going to have to go through an election cycle. So the continuing committee that helped us get to this point may not be the continuing committee that recommends it in the 2025 session. So we have to get over that hump as well. But so we hope to have a draft plan. We may have it ready earlier, but it may not behoove us to put it out until after elections. Great.
Well, when that draft plan is ready, we'd love to have you guys again and maybe highlight some of the changes and some of the feedback that you've received and how you implement, or how you took that into account in revising the plan. But I think that is it for now in terms of questions, unless there's anything else that you all want to add right now.
No. Again, thank you for having us and for letting us talk about this. The email address is up on the screen, as well as the website to view the actual draft plan. We'd love to hear from you, and any thoughts, concerns, questions you have, please just get in touch with us.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, guys. We look forward to seeing the next version of the plan, and hopefully getting this adopted on schedule and without any hiccups. We know how some of the political politics can play out, but you know, hopefully we can support you in this effort.
Great. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks.